You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda. And joining me today on the podcast is Matt Schrader, who's a China analyst at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks so much for joining me, Matt. How are you doing today?
Yeah, doing okay. Slowly going insane in quarantine, but other than that, everything's great.
Yeah, all things considered. But no, thanks a lot for coming on the show today. So, listeners, the reason I have Matt on is because he's the author of a fascinating new report published through his organization called Friends and Enemies, a framework for understanding Chinese political interference in democratic countries. And surprise, surprise, this is a hot topic around the world, not least here in the United States, because we're in an election year and there have been accusations, including from President Trump himself, that China is seeking to interfere in the election. There have been credible accusations from other parts of the American intelligence community, political apparatus. This is a big issue in Europe. It's a big issue in Australia, New Zealand, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Northeast Asia. Certainly, you look around the world and you begin to see a Chinese party state apparatus that is looking at the ways in which it can seek influence to better accomplish its means around the world. But I'm not going to tell you about that because I'm not the expert. Matt is. So Matt, without further ado, I did want to give you an opportunity to first introduce yourself before we get into our conversation today. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into, how you found yourself writing this report on Chinese political interference in 2020.
Well, I appreciate you calling me the expert. It's a little... it's great to be here with you right now because I've been a fan of the podcast and your work for such a long time, and I don't think I've seen anybody who knows so much about such a shockingly wide range of things on Asia other than you. So it's really a privilege to be able to talk with you a little bit about this and subject the report to some really informed questioning. How did I end up here? I lived in China for 10 years after I graduated college. I finished university and studied Chinese a little bit during my university and spent some time in China then, and felt like I hadn't really finished the job of learning the language, and also having gotten the first kind of taste of the country at that point. It was sort of like this whole world had opened up to me. So I just wanted to learn more. I wanted to get my Chinese really good. I wanted to understand as much as I could about this place. And also I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do with myself at the age of 23. So I packed up and moved to Beijing, and with the idea I'd be coming back in 2 or 3 years for grad school. And I ended up coming back 10 years later for grad school. At that point, it had gotten pretty clear in like 2017, 2018 that China was really changing the game globally. In 2013-14, you'd seen the construction of islands in the South China Sea, and any number of other sort of really concerning forms of assertive behavior that had emerged, during my time in the country. And so I felt like one way I could contribute usefully was by trying to help everyone figure out, make some sense of all of these new, more assertive or coercive forms of PRC behavior we were seeing around the world. And so did a graduate degree in Asian studies, did sort of the internship into research assistant thing that you do in DC, while getting steadily more interested in these, what are now called like PRC influence or PRC interference, this kind of aspect of PRC geopolitics. And that ended up with me at the place I am now, writing the report that just came out.
All right. Well, no, I think that's a familiar story for a lot of people. I guess that find themselves turning into, the so-called China hand. Obviously, yeah. I think there is a fair range of variance in the paths that people do take to end up where they go. But yeah, that's certainly, yeah. I think I can see that. I mean, especially if you were in China, and just witness firsthand many of these changes with the increased assertiveness under Xi Jinping, especially, completely makes sense. That you
it's like what white guy becomes fascinated with Asia? News at 11.
Yeah. Well, as long as the work is solid, and in this case it is, I have no issues. But let's dig in a little to PRC influence. I'm going to be a little cheeky here. I mean, look, we talk about PRC, influence seeking, interference, different things. I think there's actually maybe a little bit of a distinction between those two terms that's maybe worth talking about. But I
Yep.
mean, this is something that all countries do, right? I mean,
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
country wants to seek influence overseas. The United States does it
Hmm.
in different ways, right? I mean, you could talk about things like even non-governmental efforts, like Hollywood
Hmm.
as
Hmm.
effectively granting the U.S. influence overseas in many ways. And I know I'm being cheeky here because obviously the way in which China seeks influence. Is quite different. So maybe to kind of ground our conversation today, do you want to just kind of, just take care of my cheekiness here by just giving us a
Yeah.
clear
No. No. No.
definition of what PRC influence is in your view?
Yeah, I don't. I actually don't think that's a cheeky question at all, and it's one of the reasons I'm really glad to talk with you because I think that's a really smart question to start off with. It's like the fundamental question when you're writing a report like this and thinking about these things is like, how is this different from anything the U.S. does? Because I mean, you can sort of say that the United States or other democratic countries are, better or morally superior or whatever. But like, I think you need to be able to make an argument as to why this stuff is different and more concerning. The way that I tend to think about it is through a very kind of I don't know, almost like founding fathers kind of lens, where the thing that really separates the things that the American or other democratic governments do from what the party does is simply constraints on the exercise of power. That every country has people who covet power, who covet wealth, who are ambitious, who will climb over other people to get what they want or to keep their position. China is not really any different from any other country in that respect. Um, the difference between that system and the one that we have here or in other democratic countries is simply that those sorts of people face a lot more constraints on how they're able to use their power in the United States or in Europe. Um, there's a lot more ways that they're called to be accountable. There are a lot more ways where they're called to be transparent, and a lot more ways that when they do something that regular people would judge to be morally reprehensible, um, a lot more ways that behavior can be called to light. And so when there is no, it's when there's no sunlight, it's the saying, sunlight's the best disinfectant. When there's no sunlight, I think, power tends to exercise itself in ways that can tend more towards the coercive and more towards what we would consider to be unseemly forms of influence. And so I think that because the party, the CCP, operates in a much less transparent, much more authoritarian milieu, it is accustomed to exercising power that way. And so we should not be surprised to see that, some of the characteristics I'm going to get into a little bit are forming an increasingly important and salient part of how the party is attempting to carve out space for its continued international rise.
No, I think that's a very helpful definition. And you also do the thing that I think a lot of responsible analysts in this area do, which is talk about party influence or party interference as opposed to the more blanket term that leads to some problematic associations
Yeah.
in societies with the Chinese diaspora of talking about Chinese
Yes.
influence. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that because you do talk about that in
I.
the report, and I think that's a
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
issue to
Yeah.
discuss.
I mean, like we're also going to get into that a little bit more with one of the characteristics, but this particular point, I'm really really happy you brought it up because you see people tend to talk about how the Chinese are coming to get us, or it's the Chinese government, or the Chinese people, and it's absolutely it's not China, it's not Chinese, it is this party, and not even really the entire party. It's more like the small cadre of people who form the ruling elite of this party, who I think we need to be particularly concerned about because they're relatively committed to and reap the benefits from a system whose values are very, very different from our own. And so it's important to be really careful about how we talk about that, because all of our societies in the West, and even just in democracies everywhere, it's not just a Western thing. We all have histories of racism, frankly, really scary racism. And, I talk all the time and hear all the time from folks whose families are originally from Asia who live in the United States or Europe or Australia, where they talk about their they say your nationality feels contingent. It's the permanent foreigner syndrome, where you're not allowed by the people of your country to feel as if you are a full citizen because of what your last name is, or where you feel like you're from. And I think absolutely we need to be careful in how we speak about this, so we don't encourage those sorts of feelings, and we don't encourage the sorts of attitudes that can lead to policies that disproportionately hurt people from those communities. So thank you very much for bringing that up and letting me do that spiel.
Because, no, I think it's important. I mean, especially I think there's an instrumental value to it, right? Because exactly what you said about keeping nationality in contention is something that the party seeks to do itself. So yes. by playing into those narratives, we're actually, in a way, abetting the effort of China instrumentalizing the diaspora, yes. which is one of your points. But that's maybe a good segue to actually get into now the nuts and bolts of party influence. I mean, you've done a very helpful thing in your report by giving us, five points to kind of structure your framework here. So that makes my job easy as the host. So I'm going to link to your report in the show notes. So listeners, if they do want to get deeper into things, can read it for themselves. But I did want to offer you an opportunity to go through your framework, which I actually think is a very helpful way to think about this topic more broadly. So your first one is weaponizing China's economy. And I think that's an interesting one to talk about in early 2020, particularly as certain countries in Asia seek to sort of reshore business, reduce their exposure to the Chinese mainland, and obviously something that Chinese leaders are concerned with preventing at the time. But tell us a little bit more about the ways in which China has weaponized its economy, and maybe a few case studies that you think are good exemplars of that.
Yeah, and the thing about the sections, I got to give all credit for that goes to my boss, Laura Rosenberger, Zach Cooper, my other boss, and Jamie Fly, my former boss, who were this. I'm sure you know about this when you're starting a big project, like your first ideas versus what ends up coming out the other end are just like they barely even resemble each other because of all of the other help and input that other people have put into it. So you having an easy structure to go off of is very much thanks to the effort of those people. The weaponizing China's economy. So the fundamental fact of the party's international rise is that China has, by some measures, now the world's largest economy. People debate about whether or not PPP is an appropriate measure, but according to some measures, China's economy is now larger than the United States. And simply by itself, the size of this economy and its potential for future growth exerts a gravitational pull on the politics of other countries because of how it incentivizes business people in other countries to deal with their governments, and how it incentivizes governments to think about their foreign policy because of their domestic political constituencies. And the party is fully aware of this dynamic. And what we have seen is a tendency to use market access, to use the ability to do business in China or to trade with China as a way to punish people the party defines as enemies and reward people that it defines as friends, hence the title of the report, Friends and Enemies. So just to give a few really, really classic examples. I mean, the sort of the text for this was when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a Chinese intellectual named Liu Xiaobo in, I think it was 2010, if I remember right. And Liu Xiaobo was he was very active in the Tiananmen movement in 1989, spent a long time in prison afterwards, and then helped contribute to a document named Charter 08, or Charter 2008, that was a statement by a whole bunch of Chinese intellectuals essentially supporting constitutional government in China in 2008. And for his trouble, he was thrown into prison. He would spend the rest of his life there, and died of cancer a couple of years ago. Probably was denied medical treatment towards the end. But in 2010, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee saw fit to award him the prize in absentia. And the Chinese government, the party, proceeded to, throw a hissy fit. And it wasn't just, diplomatic démarches. It wasn't just mean words on paper. They more or less cut off exports of salmon from Norway to China. And there's wonderful graphs showing how, like, over the next 5 or 6 years, the share of the salmon import market in China went from being almost entirely Norway's to being a mix of Faroe Islands, Iceland, Sweden. Norway ended up losing, by some estimates, more than $1 billion as a result of the decision by this Nobel Peace Prize Committee, which is not a government decision. Like, the Norwegian government didn't make that call. It was, a committee appointed by people in the government, but ultimately they're independent. As a result of that, the Norwegian salmon industry was made to suffer. And, about 6 or 7 years later, the two countries came to more or less a detente on the issue. And relations between the two countries were repaired, but it was at the cost of Norway, denying the Dalai Lama a platform to speak inside their own country. It was at the cost of toning down some of its previous activism and outspokenism on human rights. This is just one example. The report contains a lot more examples, and there's a lot of examples that I just didn't have room to get into.
Another huge one that comes to mind is how South Korea was treated after accepting the THAAD deployment. That's one that comes to mind immediately.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing about these boycotts is, like, they'll make headlines for a few months or half a year, but like, they go on even after they fall out of the headlines. Mm-hmm. Like, the salmon boycott went on for the better part of a decade. Some elements of the THAAD boycott are still in place now, 3 or 4 years later. So the party's got a long memory and holds a long grudge on this stuff, and it's gotten to the point where this is a calculus in every government's decision making and how it deals with China, because the party has successfully communicated that there are costs to how you speak about China.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I would love to do an entire episode about the idea of weaponizing the Chinese economy, but unfortunately, to get through the entire framework, we're going to have to move forward. I'm just saying that not to push you ahead rudely here or anything.
No, it's fine. Like, any one of these characteristics could probably be a book by itself.
Absolutely.
Like, there's so much there.
Right. Anyways, your second point is asserting narrative dominance, which I think is, again, super timely to talk about in early 2020. I mean, we heard a lot a few weeks ago about China's mask diplomacy and China sort of, saving the world with personal protective equipment, basically showing the Europeans that China was going to be their best friend. And, things have gone a little back and forward there with reports coming out that China's been demanding that European leaders first praise Beijing before actually making deliveries of face masks and what have you. But that's just one example that came to mind. But tell us a little bit about how the party seeks to assert narrative dominance around the world, particularly in democracies.
Yeah. And sort of the way that I think about this particular characteristic is that, the party takes an inordinate interest in how other countries and people in other countries, particularly elites, how they talk about China, how China is understood in other countries, the means through which China is understood. I think it takes an interest in these things, really to a much greater extent than, for example, like the United States. I mean, frankly, for the most part, like, we don't really care what other countries are saying about us. We get criticized all the time, every day, all around the world, and until recently, that wasn't really a cause for economic fisticuffs. But the party's a little bit different on this, and I think that has a lot to do with kind of the Marxist-Leninist heritage it has. It seeks narrative dominance inside its own country, and it's built the world's most sophisticated censorship apparatus to do so, the world's most sophisticated propaganda apparatus to shape how people think about their country and its place in the world from the moment they start going to school. To varying degrees of success. Chinese people are not, automatons, but it is possible to set the boundaries of people's worldviews fairly successfully through these efforts, and it's doing it increasingly to other countries. And it kind of does it through two main channels. I think one is through like positive, active propaganda, and so this is stuff like the mass diplomacy you're talking about, where you get like People's Daily and China Daily and Global Times. Like they send a photographer to the airport to take a picture with the local, the ambassador to the local country and the local officials, and then they blast that out over their social media, both at home and abroad. So that's one aspect, and I tend to think that aspect is like not always super effective. It's certainly not as effective as the Russia Today RT, the stuff that Russia has built, where it's able to be really catchy and really popular and has a genuine audience in countries that are not Russia. The place where I think the party is really, really effective in its quest for narrative dominance is seeking to suppress what I call adversarial narratives, narratives that the party doesn't want people discussing or talking about or thinking. Now, obviously, we discuss these things all the time in Western societies and democratic societies. You and I are doing this right now. But there are many, many examples of the party primarily using its economic strength to suppress how certain topics are presented or whether they're presented. And the classic example of this is Hollywood. This is the one that I get into in some depth in the report. In 1997, Hollywood put out 3 movies that were fairly critical of the party. It was Kundun, which was a Martin Scorsese film about the Dalai Lama. Red Corner, Richard Gere as a businessman falsely accused inside of China, and 7 Years in Tibet with Brad Pitt, which I think needs no further introduction. Mm-hmm. All 3 of those films were pulled from distribution inside of China. But not only the films, but all films belonging to those studios were all pulled from distribution inside of China. And it was made really, really clear to all of the studios involved. And, there's contemporary news sources. You can go back and find all this. Really clear to all of the studios involved that if they wished for the continued growth of their business inside of China, that this could no longer happen. And this is around the same time as Disney, who was the studio that put out Kundun, began its quest for a theme park inside of China. This is 1996, 1997. And Shanghai Disney World would open, Disney World, Disneyland, I think it's Disneyland. Shanghai Disneyland would open eventually, like 20 years later. But this is also taking place in the context of WTO negotiations over China's accession to the organization. And a really important part of those negotiations is the access of Western films to the Chinese film market. So this is a really crucial point in time for Hollywood studios' involvement in the Chinese market. And in the course of putting this report together, me and a research assistant actually went back and we looked at the top 50 films by box office for every year since then. And not a single film in the top 50 box office since 1997 has had anything bad to say about China. There's been no film that put out any kind of narrative that the party thinks is objectionable. And actually, in more recent years, you've seen movies like Gravity, like The Martian, Iron Man 3, where it's presenting China and the party in a light more like what the party prefers, which is as kind of a benign partner for international cooperation. And I think we've sort of normalized this censorship of Hollywood, but it's really quite extraordinary when you think about it, that the party has essentially the party's managed to piggyback its messages on American soft power by weaponizing its economy. And you think about like the Soviet Union would have killed to be able to do this in the 1970s or the 1980s. And so the party now has managed to accomplish things that the Soviet Union never dreamed possible,
Right.
in the realm of suppressing messages that it doesn't like in other societies.
Yeah, no, the gravity example is actually one of my favorite ones because not only is the Chinese government presented as, like you said, a benign collaborator in saving Sandra Bullock from outer space, but the spoilers for Gravity here, but the movie starts with an anti-satellite weapon test.
Yep.
And China, the People's Liberation Army, was widely criticized for precisely such a test in 2007. And guess which country conducts the test as part of the narrative in Gravity? It's Russia, which is actually notable for not having conducted a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon test against a live satellite target. So it's a fascinating little twist on both sides in the narrative of China's presented as the savior, and even though we have a close real life analog to the event that kicks off the movie Gravity, it's not China that's responsible for that in the movie.
Yeah, and I want to dwell on this one just a little bit longer because it's so fascinating. I mean, that's again, like we're talking a lot about how Russia interferes in democracies, but this is really not a tool that Russia has available to it in the same way that China does. And Hollywood's one example, but it trickles down throughout the mechanisms that we use to create and distribute knowledge related to China in our societies. And so a good example is that lots of times university chairs or think tanks are funded by, for example, wealthy business people or philanthropists or companies. And if people like that know that there is a cost to being associated with work that is critical of the party, then that's a powerful deterrent to funding that kind of work or funding that kind of study. And it can be an incentive to fund work that does the opposite, or at the very least does not problematize our relationship with China. And so it's interesting to see how this economic gravity of the PRC can sort of warp the entire structure of the conversation on China throughout democratic countries.
Economic gravity. I like what you did there.
Oh yeah, hey, look at that.
All right.
I mistakenly was funny.
Yeah. So, all right, I'm gonna again keep you moving here through the framework because we do have 3 other points to get through, and I know. I mean, both of us are just falling into this thing where we want to talk about this stuff forever. But let's talk about point number 3, which is relying on elite intermediaries, which I think is an interesting point here. I think we've actually touched on this a little bit already, but do you want to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I'll go through this one, I think, a little bit more quickly. I mean, we talked a little bit about it already, in that the people who are disproportionately the subject of party pressure are, people with wealth or power in other countries. It's also the same actually inside of China, I think, to a degree that people don't really appreciate. This is when you start hearing about the United Front in China. Basically, like, the United Front it's the tool and the set of philosophies that the party uses to make sure that the very tip top of Chinese society understands that the party's in charge, and they will at least grudgingly do what the party asks of them to advance its policy agenda. And the so-called United Front Work Department, which is the part of the party whose job it is to operationalize this stuff, actually has there's literal sub-bureaus of the department that are named after the sections of elite society that the party targets. So there's literally a bureau that's intellectuals. There's a bureau that's basically it's business people. There's another bureau that's overseas Chinese. And so the party actually names the sections of Chinese society that are not the party, that it wants to bring under its umbrella and make sure that they're singing from the same song sheet as the party. And as China's economy has grown, because all this comes back to China's economy, and become increasingly interconnected with other parts of the world, these PRC societal elites are increasingly present in the political, economic, and intellectual lives of other countries. And the party goes out of its way to make sure that these folks have an incentive to support the party's policy objectives. And that can, in some cases, lead to some concerning behavior. So, Huawei is the example that I cite in the report. There are really, really strong indications that Huawei has supported intelligence operations by the PRC in European and other countries. Really, really credible allegations. It's helped democratically elected governments in Africa censor and harass political foes. Really, and it can do all of this under the guise of a nominally private company that's able to message other countries' publics via all the tools of corporate thought leadership, like marketing, advertising, editorials, lobbying. And so this use of elite intermediaries gives the party a range of very, very powerful tools that, again, like the Soviet Union, never really had available to itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case here, I think. Anyways, I'm going to keep us moving, just in the interest of getting to some of the more interesting ones you have towards the end. Instrumentalizing the Chinese diaspora, we hit on this at the beginning, but I think you're right to emphasize how important this is. I think this is one maybe talking about a little bit more because it manifests in similar but distinct ways in I guess places like Australia and New Zealand and Southeast Asia, Europe, even the United States. What are the main means by which, or at least the most effective means by which, you think the party succeeds in instrumentalizing the Chinese diaspora?
Yeah, and I sort of want to emphasize here that, like, of all these characteristics, I think that this one is it's far and away the most insidious of all of the other stuff that the party is doing, because, like, the party makes absolutely no bones about it that it's targeting overseas Chinese communities, and it in many cases believes it's owed the loyalty of these communities, that it's the job of these communities to contribute to China's national rejuvenation. There's not even really the conception of the notion that nationality or identity could be separate from race, which is like a very 19th century worldview, but it's one that the party espouses unabashedly. And the policies that come out of this lead the party to encourage like dual loyalty,
right?
Like that's like actual party policy is like we want you to hold dual loyalty when targeting overseas Chinese communities, and these are communities that have struggled literally for centuries with precisely that issue, that they are seen as holding dual loyalties within their societies, and they are subject to discrimination and racism as a result of that. The most famous example of this in the United States is, Korematsu versus the United States, that upheld the right of the U.S. government to hold American citizens of Japanese descent in concentration camps during World War II for no other reason than their families are from Japan. There's a real history of racism in these societies, and it's not just a history. It carries on today. There's a study by Cardozo Law School finding that people of Asian descent, when they're subject to federal prosecution for a federal trade espionage law, are more likely to be incorrectly prosecuted. They're more likely to be found innocent. They're more likely to be more harshly sentenced for the same crimes. These communities are not just like making up these concerns out of thin air. There's really good reasons for them to be worried about how the societies they live in will perceive them and treat them as a result of the Chinese Communist Party's determination to be the most powerful political entity in the world. and so that's it's this incredibly difficult catch-22. That the way the party goes about doing this kind of stuff is through a range of outreach organizations that are sort of devoted to building connections with overseas communities, and it's a very large and very well-resourced bureaucratic apparatus. There's in every embassy in a developed country, there are very well-staffed sections devoted to identifying, scientific and technological workers of Chinese descent in the country who might have something valuable to contribute to the national rejuvenation of the homeland, and trying to build connections with those people and incentivizing those people to work with Chinese researchers and work for China. There's a number of sort of, we'll call them ancestral organizations that are dedicated to keeping up connections between people from a particular part of China who have gone to other countries. So like people from Guangzhou or people from Fujian or people from even particular cities in these provinces. And these are organizations that in many cases are directly overseen by the United Front Work Party,
right?
Or United Front Work Department. Again, this is one where we could go on forever and ever, but it's a super, super insidious thing the party does because, they don't care about how it affects societal cohesion in other countries, and trying to combat it, like, it is almost always going to look racist because the people that you're going after will almost always have Chinese last names and be from China.
Yeah, no, it's been a big problem with especially like counterintelligence operations in the United States. You look at the series of indictments that have been coming out of DOJ, and you just see this pattern. And obviously, like you said, it's a catch-22 because there is a real need to do counterintelligence against the Ministry of State Security in China. But when it turns out that many of the assets that are being recruited in the United States and elsewhere are individuals of Chinese ethnicity that may or may not have any links to the party or even have relatives in mainland China, it just becomes this very insidious issue. I mean, it pollutes the whole notion of people-to-people exchange with China in general. I mean, you can look at the debate that just Tom Cotton kicked off of all people a few days ago on Chinese students coming to the United States, and you're just reading what people are saying about that issue, and like I can see why there is a debate here, but like you said, I mean, this one is definitely, I think, the most difficult one for. Liberal democratic states that really prize this idea of the notion of citizenship as something equitable and available to all people equally. This is, I think, the very tool of Chinese overseas influence that really cuts at that.
Yeah, you've hit it right on the head there. It's weaponizing the precisely the notion in liberal democracies that everybody should be treated equally and nobody should fall under suspicion because of where their family is from or what the color of their skin is. And it's poisoning the debate precisely because those people are targeted because of where they're from by the party. And I don't really think we have a good handle right now on how to do this right without being, frankly, without being racist or causing undue alarm among communities that are affected by this. We're in very early days of this conversation.
All right. So that brings us to, I think, the final point in your framework, which we've actually hit on this on a few previous episodes of the podcast that listeners might be familiar with, where we were talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and China's interest in exporting its model overseas. But this is the notion of embedding authoritarian control. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what exactly that means in the context of your report, Matt?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of debate over whether China is seeking to export authoritarianism intentionally. There's some very, very smart people arguing both sides of the case. Jessica Chen Weiss's work, for example, is very persuasive in arguing that although we may be seeing the export of authoritarianism, that is not necessarily as the result of a conscious policy goal on the party's part. I've sort of chosen to elide that debate a little bit and just say that, we're seeing it. So we need to kind of grapple with the fact that that's happening and what do we do about it? This comes about, I think, mostly as a consequence of the party's way of doing business, which is simply that of an authoritarian party. I mean, the party is itself very secretive. When people join up, they sign an oath. Sorry, they swear an oath to protect the party's secrets. The party's ultimate control of Chinese society and exemption from the constitution and Chinese law is written into the constitution itself. The party disciplines its members through a parallel shadow legal system that operates above and outside the purview of the country's courts. That's been the case for many years now. So I don't think it's an enormous. Oh, and also corruption and bribery are part and parcel of how influence is accumulated and exercised inside of the party's political system in China. So I mean, I don't think we should be like hugely shocked when we see that both the Chinese government itself and entities that have grown up inside this system abide by these sorts of norms when they begin to establish themselves outside of China. A really great example of this. I mean, there's this absolutely insane story by the Wall Street Journal. I guess it's about a year and a half ago now. It always blows my mind that more people don't know about this story. But essentially, to boil down a fairly complex case, what was then the government of Malaysia, and I can't remember the name of the prime minister anymore. I'm sure you do. The previous
Najib Razak. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, his government was in a little bit of trouble because of its creation of a development fund called 1MDB that it turned out that it was using essentially as a slush fund. At the time all of this was going on, Malaysia was also negotiating with China for basically to sign on to some really large Belt and Road infrastructure projects. There was going to be a rail line running up the east side of the country's sort of main peninsula, a couple of other really big projects. And while this is going on, the Wall Street Journal is doing a lot of really good groundbreaking reporting on all of the shenanigans with 1MDB and giving the Malaysian government a lot of headaches. This is all about a year before the elections that eventually would turn this government out of office. So with this set of circumstances, a couple of very senior PRC officials show up for negotiations with the Malaysian government and say, all right, we'll make you guys a deal. We have established full operational surveillance, this is their phrase, full operational surveillance of the Wall Street Journal's reporters and offices in Hong Kong who are doing this reporting on 1MDB. So we got their phones tapped, we're reading their email, following them around, we're digging through their trash. They can't let a peep out with us knowing who that peep is let out to. We will give you the results of this take and help you identify who inside the Malaysian government is talking to the Wall Street Journal so you can do what is necessary. Again, their words. In exchange for us giving you the results of us spying on the Wall Street Journal reporters in Hong Kong, we're going to want you to sign on to not only do we want you to do the current BRI projects, but we want you to do more BRI projects, and we want them to be priced at above market rates. So essentially, we want to make sure that the amount of squeeze we get out of this is 20 or 30% more than we're already talking about. At the same time, we will help pay down some of the debt that you are unable to pay on 1MDB, and we will put pressure on the U.S. Department of Justice to cease their investigation of what's going on with 1MDB, because there was, at the time, a large DOJ investigation of what was going on that eventually would prosecute a number of people. And the officials from the PRC who made this offer said that they were making this offer with the knowledge and the explicit approval of the two most powerful people in China, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, the premier. The story is insane. It's insane. It's incentivizing a democratically elected government both to be very corrupt, to be secretive, to be non-transparent, and to enjoy the fruits of spying on members of the free press. And the amounts that we're talking about in this case are billions and billions and billions of dollars. I think it's a fantastic example of some of the behavior we're now seeing China engage in around the world. And it goes back again to the potency of China's economic interconnectedness with the rest of the world, that having these kind of financial and economic tools gives the party a number of really potent options to try to shape how other states behave.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the 1MDB example is a really good one. I mean, also in general around Southeast Asia, the 1MDB case was really a wake up call. I mean, not a wake up call for many governments, I guess, who continue to see advantages to behaving in the ways that you described, but certainly for, I think, many civil society organizations and journalists in the area, just the extent to which China can go to in seeking influence in many of these places.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
We are getting short on time. In fact, we're over time.
Sorry,
but this has really been fascinating. So
I could talk all day, every day about this. It's just there's so much to talk about.
Yeah. No, I thought this was a very helpful tour de force of understanding the notion of party influence around the world and the means by which the party tries to seek influence. Matt, thanks a lot for joining me. I really hope to have you back on, particularly when we do have a news peg to talk about some of these topics, maybe in a little bit more of a detailed way. But thanks a lot for taking the time to speak with me today.
Yeah, no worries, Ankit. And it would be a privilege to come back and talk with you. I love the work that you do, love the work the Diplomat does. So anytime, I'm always happy.
Thank you for those kind words. And hope to have you on soon. Thanks.
All right. Take care.
All right, and for our listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, Spotify, TuneIn, any other number of podcast providers out there. We're pretty widely accessible. And finally, if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you'd go ahead and do that. And finally, before we close, a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com.